everyone, and welcome back to a fresh dose of the Unbiased podcast. I'm delighted to be coming back to you after a break, and I'm coming back to you in video format now, as well as audio. And in having a bit of a break over the last few months, it's given me some time to really reflect on where I want this podcast to go from here. So, to date, Unbiased has been about storytelling. It's been about giving a platform to voices that we don't hear quite so much of in the mainstream media. And they've been sharing their stories of how biases around them had affected their day-to-day lives and what they do to address them and put back to try and redress some of those imbalances that exist around us. And over the past year, be it through really upskilling myself in my coaching practice and having some time to really introspect and reflect, it's both thrown up a lot for me in terms of conflicting views on so many of the big topics that we cover and that get addressed in the corporate DEI space. And it's really made me think in the context of what I mean or what I want to explore in Unbiased, a bit more about my own and our own internal biases, the ones that actually stop us from being the best version of ourselves. And I guess where that rabbit hole has taken me down, it's taken me on a path to really explore authenticity, what that means for me and the people in my world, to think about whether our identity, as it gets pushed and pulled through many external factors, can actually contribute to our sense of burnout and can be an energy drain to try and be someone we're not. It made me reflect on something that had come out from a lot of guests over the course of recording Unbiased. And that was the extent to which labels had often boxed many of my guests in. And yet it's those same labels that kind of create the markers for corporate DEI efforts today. And so I guess this is what I really want to start to unpack over the next little while. And joining me today to start that discussion is actually the beautiful guest who I recorded with for the very last, for episode 50 of Unbiased at the beginning of this year. It's Khayshie, Tilak, Ramesh. Welcome, Khayshie, and thank you for being game enough to dive into this with me today.
Oh, thanks for having me, and it's so good to be on video. We're on the screen. It's going to be an all.
You're looking flash. I love it.
Life.
And now, Khayshie, you and I, we met as part of the DEI scene in Australia, and you have become a real authority on intersectional gender equality. You've represented both yourself and your country on the global stage at the UN in New York on 2 occasions now. But also offline, you and I have connected a fair bit over sometimes our feeling that we don't always fully align with maybe the rigidity, if that's the right word, of the corporate DEI space. And we bounce around these ideas that exist between the two of us, but we're not sure how much to share out there. And so I'm kind of calling on you today to help me unravel this mini existential crisis of mine and tell me I'm not alone in this kind of conflict, that notions of identity and belonging are sort of both the problem and the solution. You pick where you want to start with this, Kate.
Oh, absolutely. I feel, first of all, wholeheartedly agree on so many of the points you've said. And I think it's so ironic to hear you sort of reflect that we know each other from the DEI space, because I feel like we talk every other week now, which is great. I couldn't agree more when it comes to identity and belonging. I think that there's such important concepts and there's such core concepts that resonate with you and I, that it's so easy for us to get so tied up in what our identity is and what it means and what the labels are, I guess, that are assigned to us, that sometimes it's very easy for someone else to tell us what our story is. without us sort of reflecting on what our story might mean and what we've experienced and how we unpack it. So I think, first of all, absolutely agree. On the second point, I do think it's also really difficult to be on the other side of it. And when you do have a lot of people in the DEI space who are trying to create strategies and there's deliverables and they're really trying to figure out a way to unpack this all, using labels as identities and being able to put people in neat boxes is somewhat convenient. Unfortunately, identity is not convenient, as you and I know. So I think it's a really apt place for us to start with unpacking is identity more than what meets the eye.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe part of that issue is when we're thinking about DEI efforts, when we're thinking about addressing the perceived problems that exist around us, we kind of can remove ourselves each out of the equation and we can start to put the blame on all these other factors. And I wonder whether, and maybe where I'm going with thinking about this in the context of bias and this podcast, which I called Unbiased, initially thinking about those external things, is there something to be said for saying, if we actually just all really took the time to work on ourselves and to really, really look to the root cause of what doesn't serve us as individuals, maybe that could start that domino process. Maybe the inclusion piece and affecting the world around us would kind of happen naturally if everyone is taking that responsibility for themselves. Have you seen that play out for you personally or in your world at all?
Yeah, I often say, and I think it was someone asking me one of those like icebreaker questions, which was, if you could pick a super power, what would it be? You know, that typical sort of scene. And I think when I reflected on it for a really long time, I would say that the one thing that would make life easier, but also our jobs easier, is if people could step outside their own experience. And if they could reflect on what it is about the way that they've been raised, or what it is about the way that the cultures they've been brought up in, or even the beliefs that they've had that have been, you know, substantiated over so many years. What are the things that are within our control to break down within the things that we know and the way that we operate? And then look at the external systems. And I often find that ability to look at ourselves and to reflect and to really understand the ways in which we might be perpetuating systems, knowingly or unknowingly, if everyone was just to do that, gosh, I feel like we would go so far. It's such a huge, huge piece to this work. And I find that is the thing that we're often up against, is the fact that people are trying to do DEI work in a little bubble. Like they're excluding themselves out of this narrative and they're trying to change all of these things around them. But they're not taking that time to self-reflect and figure out, well, what am I personally doing that might be hindering the way in which we resolve DEI?
Khayshie, I think there's a couple of things that came out there. What you were speaking about really reminded me, I'm thinking in the context of bias, of what we start to bring up, and there's that decision-making system that led us down a path of really thinking about, in the inclusion space, you know, unconscious bias training, and this, you know, how, again, although it's that problem that exists around us, one of the ways that we address it is acknowledging that we have biases that come into play, that make decisions based on our lived experiences, that can have negative connotations or negative results at the end. And when we break down, so that type of bias that we refer to, as I said, it tends to have this negative connotation. It is predicated on this idea that we can favor a particular person or group or a thing in a way that could be considered unfair. So that could manifest itself in showing favoritism, in prejudice, or engaging in kind of stereotyping to help us just try and figure out a person or a group from another. But actually, the very thing that actually got me into this, really interested in this whole space of bias, really removing almost DEI and just looking at it from that really human perspective. It was actually, there's this book, I don't know if you read it, it's called Thinking Fast and Slow. And there's this Nobel laureate, passed away this year, I think, Daniel Kahneman. And I ended up going down a rabbit hole of all of his work. But Thinking Fast and Slow, this breaks down at a human level that we all have two systems of thinking. There's system one thinking and system 2 thinking. System 1, that's our thinking fast. That is making the snap judgments, emotional, autopilot decisions that's based on our own personal lived experiences and the judgments that have culminated on or laid themselves on top of each other throughout the course of our lives, that enables us to distill a lot of information very quickly as and when we may need. Then there's this system 2 thinking. That's the thinking slow element. That's the taking a considered approach, taking all, various factors both inside and around us, using that logical, analytical side of ourselves. It might be when we're sitting down to nut through a complex problem or an issue at work. And then we arrive at a conclusion based on engaging with that system 2 thinking, based on taking the time and actually picking out those factors rather than that snap decision making. And those shortcuts they're called heuristics. And what you see through reading this book and through all the work that he had done with his teams and experiments is that people are not good at making good decisions when they engage in system 1 thinking. And people are actually overestimate how good they are at that sort of thing. We also tend to put our hands up and say, oh, we're less biased than the person next to us. And actually, the more biased you are, the more likely you are to think that you don't have those heuristics. And that was a real game changer for me because, it eliminates this kind of them and us. I think it takes some of the judgment out of the way these heuristics work. I think let's just all work on this playing field that our human brains are fallible and they let us down. And really then, in a similar way to saying when we deal with unconscious bias, the idea is to get more biases to the conscious mind so we can start to address them. In this system 1, system 2 thinking space, we really want to try to make as many decisions as we can by using our system 2 thinking. And yet we live in a world that is constantly forcing us to make quicker and quicker decisions based on an overload of more and more information. And this is kind of driving some of my interest on one hand, and why it came to mind when you were sort of talking about that them and us, and suddenly, inclusion practitioners and people that are trying to affect this change have to almost be perfect in and of themselves, because otherwise we lose the ground that we have to stand on with others. But what are your thoughts then on if we take a step back and just think of ourselves all as people moving through this world, just trying to make the best decisions that we can with the information that we have? How can our experiences in the areas and in your particular experiences from your work, how can we flip that back on ourselves? And how can we move, or do we need to move the discussion out of just inclusion and into performance? And because these are not just affecting the decisions that we make in terms of how we interrelate with other people. These are affecting our performance on day-to-day, in our day-to-day jobs, in our day-to-day lives. They could be decisions that we make on a knife edge that change the course of things altogether. So breaking that down, it's how do we use that to help us on a broader level? And what are the challenges, do you think, to switching that narrative back onto ourselves?
Yeah, I think so much of what you've shared there is so relevant, and especially with the thinking fast and slow piece, because I think that in the way that we confront bias from a training perspective, I just think there's so much wrong with it. And there's research that's out now that says that unconscious bias training isn't effective, and you can't, it makes sense, right? You have bias that you've built over, say, like 30 years, 40 years through living your life, and people think that you're going to fix it in like an hour of training. One, that's not feasible. But two, I think we don't realize how benign bias can be sometimes. And the very nature of it being unconscious means that we can't always spot it to change it, right? And this is why often in my work, I'll look at systems. Because systems are something that we can influence. And systems are some of those safety nets, I think, that we can really use when we can acknowledge that, as you said, our brains are fallible. So I think of this in the ways of like, when I talk to marketing teams, for example, I'll often say that when you're looking at representative marketing and making sure that all people and communities are representative in a deck, for example, I don't think there's anyone necessarily conniving behind a desk. He's like, I'm going to make this a really homogenous deck and I'm going to make sure that, we're going to only have 2 types of people in here. I don't think that's what happens in most circumstances. I think you have a poor person in marketing with a deadline at 5 p.m. It is like 4:45. They've been asked by their boss to do something. And now they're just pulling whatever desktop pictures they can grab that's closest available to them and putting them in a deck. So there's something that I'll often say to businesses, which is an inclusive organization cannot exist within an overworked organization. So if you're expecting unreasonable things from people, I think that is one of those really key sort of red flags for me where I'm like, what are the chances this person can switch to system 2 thinking or can take that time to question their first guess, which is often, that's what we teach in unconscious bias. It's not that you must be completely unbiased like this podcast. You must be, your judgment must be the best in every single situation. It's that when your brain does switch and quickly make a decision like this, do you then take that self-reflective practice to think about what you've decided and whether there's another way or whether there's something that you've forgotten about and it hasn't been built into your rote reaction to something. But if an organization doesn't have time for you to think that way, of course you're going to go with your first bias reaction. Like, it makes sense to do that, right? But I think this is something that we get wrong so often, right?
That's such an interesting point about actually the responsibility that we do all have to support each other in being able to have this time and space to reflect in ourselves and see a value in it. I also think it really gives rise to that adage that I feel you need to prefix with any new thing that you want to ask people to engage in, and that is almost just trust the process. Like, there is a reason that these things are in place, and trust me, it's going to work out for you. I've been thinking a bit about, I want to ask you about what your biases are, or what the biases that you have that don't always serve you. I feel like it's a bit harsh to ask you first and not share some of mine, but I've definitely spent a lot of time thinking about some of my own in particular, and some of that has played out in this podcast, and maybe it does even with you and I. For example, Khayshie, I have a real affinity bias. If I find that, someone who is similar to me, who aligns with everything that I think, then we can be best friends. And you and I have probably morphed into that, where I think, we need the naysayer in the room, because we could definitely talk each other around to the same worldview. There are a number of biases that get called out in this book, for example, but there are things like an anchoring bias, which I realize I have really strongly, usually plays out when I'm shopping or something. If you go into a store and you see something for $500 and then you go into another one and you see it for $50, you're going to think that $50 one is a steal, because my brain has anchored myself to the $500, even if it costs 50 cents to make. I think $50 is really good value. And that really plays out in me actually being able to think bigger, to think outside of things that have already been kept in place. It makes me someone that tends to struggle to go outside of the status quo. What are your vices? What are your biases that
how much time do we
inhibit you on a day?
I feel like it is very much our world is riddled with bias. Like, even in the example you just shared, the fact that you were like, okay, well, this is $50 a steal. In my mind, I was like, what's wrong with the $50 product? If someone else is selling it for $500. So even that is like a really funny and tangible example of how my brain and your brain work differently. And I feel like I noticed this the most when my partner and I moved in together, because all of a sudden I was confronted with what someone buys, and what brand they buy. And I didn't realize that I was such a home brand buyer until my poor partner, who's very lovely, would reach for the name brand. And I'd be like, what are you doing? why are you reaching for name brand? And then it was such a really fantastic example of like, I've grown up my whole life buying home brand. My parents bought home brand. I'm sure his parents probably bought something different. And his house has their own affinities to like whatever brands they have. And I think all of that stuff, plays into marketing. That when you think about unconscious bias, that we think of these really sinister examples, when sometimes it is as simple as like, I enjoy Colgate because the, traveling dentist that came to my primary school gave me Colgate this one time. And now that's just what I like, associate as a good brand for this thing. So I think there's tons of bias in the world. That's a really big piece. I also feel like, I've noticed that similar to the affinity bias you've talked about earlier, like there was a mentoring program that I was a part of recently, and I realized that there was someone who I'm like, oh gosh, I'd be a really good mentor to them, blah, blah, blah. And it's because I saw they were a lawyer. And I'm like, oh, they're a lawyer. They're going to think like me. They're also, a woman of color. They're going to think like me. I can provide them a lot of advice, And maybe there was another candidate who would just as well benefit from said advice, for example. So it's natural that, it's the same thing where you sit in an interview panel and you see that someone went to the same school as you. You'll automatically put them in a similar category to yourself. So I think that the most important part is acknowledging, there's going to be bias everywhere and not demonizing all bias. I think that's a really important step, especially with what you sort of spoken about of how do we not play some of the blame game, but then acknowledging that bias is there because could you imagine how fatiguing life would be if every single decision we make was system 2? And this goes into that whole like Steve Jobs thing where they used to say like, this is ironic that I'm wearing black while saying this, but where he used to like wake up and wear the same outfit every day because it reduces decision fatigue, blah, blah. And I think about that, the amount of decisions we need to make in a day. So it makes sense that some people are like a hardcore Weet-Bix kid and they will go for that every single time because they're switching that from a system 2 decision to a system 1 decision. So that they can reserve this brain space almost as if we have a capacity on system 2. But I think that's something that I'm really interested to maybe ask you about, which is, do you think there's a cap on the amount of system 2 thinking, I guess, that we can do per day? Or do you think it's a unlimited thing?
Yeah, like such a great question, and it's so important to maintain that not only are biases existent in everyone, but they're necessary in order for us to manage that information overload. Definitely stepping out of my comfort zone to think about a cap of it. If anything, I think, or maybe my wish for myself or a goal I'd have for myself is to really try and train that system 2 thinking to be as efficient as possible and to actually spend time at whatever opportunities we get to almost to differentiate and acknowledge that we just made this decision because we have to super quickly versus, do you know what, I have a second here to consider it. I think that's kind of probably one thing. And the onus is on each of us. And we also, people have to take responsibility for themselves. People have agency over themselves. We know what we have the time and ability for. What I encourage everyone to do is to acknowledge that this is a thing that requires us each to engage with. But what I found, what's really interesting about the home brand and a name brand like example is if you do want to engage in some self-reflection, if you want to harness that self-awareness muscle, actually looking to your biases could be a really effective way to do that. Because it's like what gets unraveled from just, oh, why am I picking Colgate over home brand? Oh, it's taking me back to my childhood. Oh, it's this. And so it could be the easiest way for you to go really deep, really quickly, and to analyze that and to just take and enjoy that journey of like, wow, I just never even thought of it. Rather than, because what I find even through coaching, you can ask these sort of questions and you'll just get this kind of, no, that's it. That's all I can think about. And then you'll ask, for a story or a narrative, and it can go into this really, 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 really deep and meaningful insight over someone. And so I think that biases could be, or using this whole kind of framework for yourself could be a really good way to fast track that self-awareness. And then the idea is that as you train that muscle, that should then help with, right, what is the capacity? What do I know? What are my values? And what will I invest the time in second guessing before I come out with an answer? What will I actually say, do you know what? This isn't worth my time right now. And I can't be judge and jury and executioner on what those things are. And I'm biased that I find this topic just so not only interesting, but just so vitally important. So if I had my way, I would force everyone to deal with their biases, but I can't do that because I shouldn't be manipulating people to do so. So yeah, I think the short answer to that is, I don't know about a cap. I don't know. I'm sure there are people in labs figuring that out. And I love this space because I know that people are really working through these things. And I think that there is a real imperative to do so on that energy and burnout front. So you've got to look at that from two angles. On the one hand, yes, if you are going to engage in heavy thinking about every single decision, it will lead to decision fatigue. You're going to burn yourself out and you're not going to perform. But on the other hand, if you go by your life blindly ignorant to things, you are not going to perform. You're going to turn people away from you, and so you kind of got to strike that balance. But the piece I have in the middle is this authenticity bit that I'm trying to use this maybe this podcast and these conversations with guests to figure out a little bit. Remember we spoke a bit about labels and actually we create these labels. They're also, I think, a necessary part of how we can make sense of the world. And it's important for us because we want to have language for our own identities and our own sense of belonging. But it can at some point become really confining, and it can suddenly become quite a divisive notion. And so if we can get to a space where we really use bias or whatever methods are related to it to get to that self-awareness, to then get to understand who we are at our authentic core, will that mean that will that help burnout? Because we're now not using up all this energy trying to be the right person in the right situation because this label says that I should behave like this, and I'm in this social situation which says I have to be able to do A, B, and C. Or like that is creating decision fatigue, creating these, and these elaborate corporate structures and social societal structures that say we have to look a certain way, act a certain way, think a certain way. If it's not authentic to yourself, that is going to cause burnout. And if you've got systems in place that only cater to a narrow mold, then there's a lot of people that are going to get burnt out. And I think I assume that there is investment going into this kind of research, because what we do know from both of our corporate DEI work is that burnout and mental health is it's an epidemic of our times, and it's affecting people at a younger and younger age.
Absolutely. It's interesting. I feel like that piece around, it's exhausting sometimes to just be a person, I think is a really important thing to acknowledge. And I think this is why I love working with this concept of intersectionality so much, because it's acknowledging that the labels, like one person doesn't equal all of the labels and the identities they're a part of. Their experience is inherently unique as someone who is experiencing all of those identities at the same time. So this is a really challenging concept that I find for, even myself when I was starting to try and understand what this looks like, because it's essentially saying that just because I am a South Asian person and I'm a woman, it doesn't mean that I will experience all the things that women experience or all of the things that South Asian people experience. But my experience is as a South Asian woman. And that is a unique experience in itself. And for me, that was like such a game changer, because it was around, okay, well, I don't relate to every single thing that is said in this community, and I don't relate to every single thing that is said in that community, but I can relate to some of the barriers that some of those communities face, or even some of the advantages and disadvantages. Like there's always two sides to the coin, right? But I think I have a friend of mine it so aptly where they were saying that they would love to see a shift from like siloed approaches to DEI, where it's like, this is all of the LGBTQIA, QIA plus stuff. This is all of the like culturally and linguistically diverse or culturally and racially marginalized stuff. This is that. And they were saying, like, wouldn't it be fantastic if we just really found out how to create identity affirming workplaces? Doesn't matter what the identity is. It doesn't create the us and them between, who is the majority and who is the minority. And often that script is flipped anyway, because the global majority are people who are considered, quote unquote diverse. So this idea of how do you affirm identity in the workplace, I think should be the question that we're continuing to sort of ask ourselves as we move forward in the States.
You've almost like stolen my kind of closing question on this whole podcast from me there, and I'll push you on it in a little bit, but you're definitely preaching to the converted a bit on that. I think this idea of how we can balance off that and labels, but as I said, not so much that it causes a massive burden should definitely be the way forward. Certainly for corporate inclusion. But also, I think I took away something quite empowering from what you were sharing and it ties into this sense of agency that we all get to determine belonging for ourselves. We get to decide based on our identities. This is not something that is given away, that we should be giving away that power to others to determine for us. So I feel like if I want to look at this in that uplifting way, or what I'm sort of putting out there for people that do feel exhausted by the concept of having to address these issues, as you said, it is just exhausting being a human. And I know that when I working with colleagues on a day-to-day basis, just on BAU, business as usual sort of tasks, you can get that sense. Then when you're then asking them to do something else on top of everything else, you've got to now self-reflect, you've got to now do these things. I totally get it. But remembering that you get to choose, that you get to form this identity, is, I feel like, a note that we should really end on in that positive way. And that's to say, thank you so much for indulging this conversation and unraveling, pulling at that thread and continuing to unravel it and share in that excitement with me. But something that I was thinking about in the context of the podcast and where we want to go with this, my real aim is to try and shift as many people who engage with Unbiased from that place of judgment, from a place of confusion to curiosity. And I think it's okay and right that we should have more questions than answers. I think in my day job as a lawyer, or even as a coach, I'm results oriented. You want to have a beginning, middle, and an end and like solve a problem. But what we do know is that these questions have been considered many, many generations before that we were born, and they're going to be continuing for many generations after we depart this world. And so what I want to know from you, and what I'll be asking all my guests at the end of this podcast, is what for you is a question, Khayshie, that remains unanswered despite all the experts that exist and to tell us what the answer is?
Ooh, great question. I feel like part of it is probably the question that we were unpacking together earlier of like, is there a limit on system 2? And I love the fact that you sort of said it's a muscle. So it's not that you have a fixed capacity to engage in this sort of slower thinking or this more intentional thinking, I'd rather say. It's that, you might feel the strain of doing it, but the more you do it, the better you get at it, which means that you will have more capacity even though you're doing more. I think that's interesting. But in terms of a question that I'd love for listeners to sort of ponder, and it's something I genuinely ponder every single day, and I ask people this every single day, which is any time you make a decision, or anytime you have a thought about something, or like you've noticed that like a thought or a position has formed in your mind really quickly, my favorite thing to ask people is, who told you that? Or where did that come from? And it's kind of coachy, but it's the funnest thing to unravel personally. And I think such an actionable sort of diversity inclusion, sure, curiosity-based, absolutely, question around, okay, well, I just picked this brand off the shelf. Who told me to do that? Where did that come from? And I think if we can get more intentional about asking ourselves those questions and being like building that muscle, as you say, and really being super duper clear on whether our thoughts come from places that we're happy with, Or is it the way we were raised? Or is it from a culture? Is it from friends or family? Whatever it is. I think that is the first step to unpacking this whole unbiased piece of, part one is absolutely acknowledging that we're biased, and that can be good and bad. But I think part two is this question of where did it come from?
I'm going to steal that.
Get away.
Whenever you're making a decision, ask yourself, who told me that? Where did that come from? Khayshie, thanks so much for joining me today.
No, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. I derive so much energy from speaking to such inspiring guests and having really meaningful and challenging conversations. If you felt the same way, my ask of you is to please subscribe to this podcast, either here or wherever you download your podcast content from. Unbiased is a labour of love for me, and the impact that these perspectives have depend on reaching as many eyes and ears as possible. So your support is invaluable. Until next time, stay curious.